Today I'm out here with one of my favorite crossovers for 2021 because it has received a few updates. The most important of which is that the optional 2.5-liter turbocharged engine can now be had for about $5,000 less, just over $30,000 in the new carbon turbo trim. Other changes for 2021 include the new infotainment system that we've seen working its way across the Mazda lineup. We first saw that in the Mazda 3 sedan and Mazda hatch. We now have it in the CX-5. And then there are a few tweaks to the safety systems. We now have optional reverse autonomous emergency braking and driver attention monitoring, but those features are not standard. Personally, I think the CX-5 is the prettiest compact crossover that's not a luxury crossover in the US, and a lot of it has to do with the front-end design. Mazda subscribes to the same sausage, different lengths school of design, so most of their vehicles look very, very similar to one another. From the front end, this certainly looks like a scaled version of the Mazda 3, the Mazda 6, the CX-9, etc. We have full LED headlights in this model. We also have LED turn signals, which is a nice touch, and LED fog lights down at the bottom. Restrained and uncontroversial is probably the best way to describe Mazda's school of design. We have relatively simple shapes, nothing too overboard going on up front. Pretty large grille right there with that large Mazda logo, and then this chrome band that goes from one side to the other and then starts interacting with the headlights. At just over 179 inches long, the CX-5 is now on the smaller end of the segment. When it first launched a number of years ago, it was pretty squarely in the middle. But a number of the chief competitors in this segment have recently grown, most notably the Hyundai Tucson, which has now leapfrogged this to become one of the larger compact crossovers. Details are still sketchy, but likely the new Kia Sportage is going to be doing the same thing. The RAV4 and CR-V are also a little bit larger. The biggest difference you'll notice between this, the RAV4 and CR-V, is right back here in the cargo area, where they generally have 25 to 30% more cargo room. Designing the CX-5, it's clear that Mazda's engineers prioritized passenger room a little bit over cargo room. So we have passenger room that's pretty similar to some of those larger options, but a smaller cargo area and a longer hood. And I think that's one of the reasons that the CX-5 looks so good from so many angles. If you stand at the front of the CX-5 and try and reach the back of the hood, you'll really notice how long the hood is. Now, we do have a little bit longer of an overhang than we find in some of the competition, but we also have a slightly longer dash to axle ratio as well. Over the last few years, Mazda has been working hard to bring the brand and their product line more upmarket. And you can see two of the prime ways that they're doing it on this CX-5. This has the turbocharged engine under the hood that's spreading its way across the Mazda lineup, and this is available in the Signature trim, which is the top-end version of Mazda's product line that brings upgraded interior components, things like real wood trim that we don't really find in most of the competition. Mazda would like you to see this as not just a competitor to the RAV4 and CR-V, but also as perhaps an alternative to a Buick or an Acura crossover. I'll go into this a little bit later in the video, but the CX-5 does fall a little bit short in some areas when compared against some of those more premium entries, but it does very well compared against mainstream crossovers. You'll notice a lot of nice touches out back, like full LED tail lamp modules rather than combination tail lamp modules, so even the turn signals are LEDs. That's pretty rare in this segment. We have well-integrated parking sensors and dual exhaust tips down at the bottom. The rear-end design of the CX-5 reminds me a little bit of modern Infinitis. At least for the moment, all CX-5s in the United States will have a 2.5-liter four-cylinder engine under the hood. The base engine is naturally aspirated and it produces 187 horsepower. We then have the optional 2.5-liter turbo that produces either 250 horsepower or 227, depending on the kind of fuel that you feed it. But this engine is always going to be producing over 310 pound-feet of torque. Now, some folks have been a little bit confused about exactly what's going on with the 227 horsepower versus 250 horsepower. It's not an on-off switch, so if you feed this regular unleaded, Mazda is basically saying you'll be getting at least 227 horsepower. The actual horsepower figure is probably somewhere in that window between 227 and 250, depending on a wide variety of conditions, your altitude, the exact grade of fuel that you fed the vehicle, and most importantly, the exterior temperature. So on a cold winter day like today, even on regular unleaded, this is going to be producing a heap of power. Rather unfortunately, this engine is still mated to Mazda's 6-speed automatic transmission, and that transmission is the likely reason that the CX-5 Turbo is not as fast 0 to 60 as the 2-liter turbo version of the Escape or something like the Acura RDX, even though this engine produces an awful lot more torque and has a pretty advantageous torque curve as well. Depending on the engine that you select and whether or not you get all-wheel drive, fuel economy will range between 28 and 24 miles per gallon. That is definitely below the Honda and Toyota competition. Bearing in mind that Mazda would like you to see the CX-5 Signature as perhaps an alternative to some near luxury or premium options out there, I'm going to give the front seats 7 out of 10 points. This front seat is not as adjustable, and we don't have the same range of motion that we'd find in luxury or near luxury alternatives. I find the seat bottom cushion to be a little bit short. There's no extending thigh cushion there. We also have a two-way adjustable lumbar support rather than a four-way adjustable lumbar, but we do have a two-position seat memory. The passenger seat does not have adjustable lumbar support at all, but we do have a tilt telescopic steering column with a large range of motion. Hopping into the back seat, as I said before, it's obvious that Mazda was prioritizing passenger room a little bit over cargo room because we have more combined legroom back here than we find in a number of options that are bigger on the outside than the CX-5. That means that this is likely going to be a little bit more accommodating for rear-facing child seats than something like the RAV4. With the front seat adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, I still have about 2 inches left, but it is worth noting that if you want more interior room, you will find some larger and more accommodating options out there. That's obvious when I move over to the right side of the vehicle. This front seat's all the way back in its tracks. I had a 6'5" person up there. I actually can't put my legs behind the rear seats without having them dig into the seat back. One thing that hasn't been upgraded back here is that even though we have air vents for the rear passengers, we don't have any USB charge ports. We do, however, have a padded center armrest. This is where we find the controls for the 3-stage heated rear seats. That's a really nice touch. There's also a small storage compartment there and 2 cup holders. Behind the power hatch, we find 30.9 cubic feet of storage space, which is about 33 to 34% less than you'll find in the largest entries in this segment. The Nissan Rogue, for instance, has nearly 40 cubic feet of storage space. Even options like the Toyota RAV4, which I have been a little bit disappointed in when it comes to the efficiency by which it was packaged, has significantly more cargo room than we find back here in the CX-5. The cargo area has something of a pyramid shape thanks to the raked rear hatch, and then of course the tilt of the rear seat backs. But thankfully Mazda has retained their 40-20-40 folding rear seat back. This is an awful lot more convenient than a simple ski pass-through or the 60-40 folding seats that we find in most of the competition. The folding center section means that it's a lot easier to put skis, snowboards, or your IKEA shopping right here into the vehicle and still seat 4. You can also fold that 20% center section via a small lever over here on the left side of the cargo area. That's a really nice touch. We don't even find that in most European competitors. Under the load floor, we find a temporary spare tire. This particular model has the optional audio system, so we do find a subwoofer there in the middle. I don't think that there's quite enough room to put a full-size spare tire under here, but seeing as the CX-5 does have somewhat narrow tires, it may be possible if you remove these foam blocks. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in the top-end signature trim. We have a pretty standard-sized moonroof right here over the driver and front passengers' heads. No pano roof in this model. The driver and front passenger have height-adjustable shoulder belts and height-adjustable headrests. It's a little bit difficult to tell on camera, but this is essentially a two-tone interior. The seats and a number of the interior accents are sort of a dark chestnut rather than charcoal, although honestly it really does look charcoal on camera. You'd have to trust me on this one. The seat bottom and back cushions are perforated because up front we have heated and ventilated seats for the driver and front passenger. At the top of the door, we find one of the more unique features in this interior, which is real wood trim. You generally don't find that in a mainstream vehicle. We have a lot of stitched materials going on there that wraps around to the dashboard. Let me know what you think about this style down there in the comment section. I wish that Mazda had a few different color variations available because the wood trim in this interior doesn't pop quite as much as I would like. It's pretty dark, and a lot of people won't necessarily realize that it's real wood trim unless you tell them. And I suppose that would sound a little bit snobby. Mazda has integrated the optional Bose speakers really well in the A-pillar, and this interior just has a really nice upscale feel to it. Everything about this interior looks like it was designed for a more premium category vehicle, including this now standard large touchscreen infotainment system. This is the same basic software that we first saw in the new generation Mazda 3. It's definitely an upgrade from what we saw in the previous generation CX-5. It is significantly faster reacting than the previous screen, but the big difference is that this is no longer a touchscreen. You now have to use the controller knob in the center of the dashboard. That's not exactly my favorite way of interacting with Apple CarPlay or Android Auto. Aside from that, the functionality of the system is definitely very similar. You rotate the wheel around, click down to select particular options. We have things like fuel efficiency monitors, Sirius XM travel link in there. But to be honest, I really wish this was still a touchscreen. I know that Mazda claims that it offers a little bit less distraction than touchscreen designs, but personally, I'm not entirely clear I believe that. Below that, we have 2 large air vents, the hazard light button, engine start, stop button, and then the controls for the dual zone automatic climate control. This is also where we find the controls for the heated seats, the ventilated seats, and heated steering wheel. There's an open storage area where you could easily keep some of your larger smartphones with their cable attached. We have a pretty standard console shifter here. Manual mode is over to the left, and then we push away from the driver for gear down. That's a little bit different than some of the competition. There's a sport mode toggle that's a simple toggle on-off rather than multiple drive modes. Behind that we have the electric parking brake, auto brake hold, and then the controller for the infotainment system. This is also where we find the volume knob. This is sort of Audi-like in its positioning. Behind all that, we find two definitely large cup holders, but I find their position a little bit awkward. You do have to kind of reach behind you if you're my height or have my length arms to grab that soda. It does make it a little bit less ergonomic. We then have a padded center armrest that opens to reveal a fairly small storage area with two USB inputs, a 12-volt power port, and this is where we find the SD card slot for the navigation database. On the driver's side, we have a partial LCD instrument cluster. This is pretty similar to the one that we find in a wide variety of different Mazda models. There's an approximately 7-inch LCD in the middle, and then we have physical gauges for the tachometer, engine temperature, and fuel gauge on the right. This display gives us our typical trip computer readouts, but it's not as configurable as I might like. It doesn't really change themes, so even if I put it in sport mode, it's not like the gauge turns red or anything like that. Above the instrument cluster, we have a pretty large binnacle because we do have an available heads-up display. This is a windshield projected heads-up display, gives us turn-by-turn navigation directions, blind spot information, etc. It definitely is a step above some of those small plastic strip heads-up displays that pop out from the dashboard. If you're not a fan of thick-rimmed steering wheels that we do find in a wide variety of the competition, you might want to take a look at the CX-5. This steering wheel is a little bit thinner than most. We have paddle shifters on the back, up on the right, down on the left. There's some sport grips above that, and this is a 3-spoke steering wheel. This doesn't have an opening down there at the bottom. On the right side of the steering wheel, we find the controls for the radar adaptive cruise control system. On the left side, we find the controls for the infotainment system, and then the info button changes the options in that multifunction LCD. The optional turbocharged engine definitely has a great feel to it, and we have significantly more power than we find in most mainstream crossovers under about $40,000. 0 to 60 in this model happened in 6.5 seconds. That is just a teeny bit slower than the last CX-5 Turbo that I tested, but it's probably just in the margin of error. Now, this is going to be a little bit slower than the Ford Escape with the 2-liter turbo, or something like the Acura RDX that you could consider this an alternative to, a value alternative, of course. But the big reason that those two go 0 to 60 faster likely has to do with the transmission. The 8-speed that we find in the Ford Escape and the 10-speed that we find in the RDX are really geared towards great acceleration profiles at the bottom end of acceleration. Good 0 to 30 times, good 0 to 60 times. We have more aggressive starting ratios, and we have ratios that are closer together. So the engine can really stay in the meat of its torque and horsepower curve and give you the best acceleration possible. That is the one thing you're going to notice about this, is that this transmission has fewer gears to choose from. Now, some folks might find that an asset. Definitely if you're playing with the paddle shifters, you won't have as many clicks to get where you want to go, but it also means that this transmission may or may not have the right gear ratio for you if you're trying to initiate a passing maneuver based on the starting speed that you're trying to pass from. Now, according to Mazda, they've designed this engine and transmission combination for real-world driving, not necessarily 0 to 60 performance tests. And that is pretty obvious. Out here at 38 miles an hour in 5th gear, I definitely have a lot of torque, so you don't need to drop a gear in order to accelerate. On the downside, if you are looking for a vehicle that has that really punchy off-the-line feeling, this isn't necessarily going to be that. Mazda's philosophy when it comes to performance and designing vehicles is a little bit different than some of the competition. We don't have terribly wide tires on the CX-5. You'll definitely find significantly wider tires on a wide number of the competition. That's one of the reasons that 60 to 0 stopping distances are longer in this than they are in a number of the key competitors. It took this model 128 feet to stop from 60 miles an hour back to 0. That's also one of the reasons that absolute road grip is not going to be as high as some of those sportier alternatives either. However, the CX-5 has a great steering feel to it. This is very engaging out on your favorite winding mountain road. It's definitely fun to drive. That fun to drive factor is certainly here, but that fun to drive factor does not necessarily equate into the highest numbers in every category. It doesn't equate to the fastest 0 to 60 time, or the shortest stopping distance, or the best absolute grip, or even the fastest time out on a track, or just the fastest to get to the end of a favorite winding mountain road. You'll certainly find better absolute grip numbers in some of the competition. Now, that is something that could be corrected in the CX-5 aftermarket, because you could obviously stick wider and grippier tires on this and improve the overall grip. Out on a rougher road like the one that I'm on here, I'm going to give this an A- when it comes to ride quality. This definitely soaks up the smaller imperfections pretty well, but the larger imperfections definitely can be felt in the cabin. The suspension in this vehicle handles rough pavement, washboard pavement, etc. very well, without the rear suspension getting upset in the same way that we can see the CX-30 getting upset sometimes. That's because the CX-30 doesn't have a fully independent rear suspension. the cabin noise score definitely benefits from the narrower tires because this is one of the quieter entries in the compact category. I got 70 decibels in here at 50 miles an hour. This is definitely quieter than something like the last RAV4 that I've driven. When it comes to cabin noise, the two main components are wind noise and environmental noise, and that would be shielded out by the glass in the vehicle, the overall aerodynamic design, and then of course road noise, which is coming from the tires through the chassis in the vehicle and of course around the wheel wells. Both of those are very well dampened in the CX-5. Corporate average fuel economy scores are obviously very important for every manufacturer, but definitely important for a small mainstream company like Mazda. That's likely one of the reasons that we don't find wider tires on this. Bottom line, out on the road, the CX-5 Turbo is an awful lot of fun. But honestly, this is not the same amount of fun as the Acura RDX. I think this has better steering feel, better steering feedback than something like the RDX, but the RDX is certainly going to whip around these corners faster, it's going to grip better, it has that torque vectoring all-wheel drive system, etc. The very fact that I'm talking about an Acura in the same sentence as I'm talking about a CX-5 really tells you how good of a job Mazda has done with the CX-5 tuning. There are a few changes I would love to see in the CX-5 and other modern Mazdas. I would love it if Mazda brought us a new transmission, say an 8, 9, or a 10-speed automatic that shifted faster and had some gear ratios targeted a little bit more at low-end performance. I would also love to see Mazda include wider tires in their vehicles when they put this 2.5-liter turbocharged engine under the hood, because this has the same size tires that we find on the regular CX-5. Now let's talk about pricing. In addition to the new infotainment system, the big change for 2021 is the price tag of the CX-5 Turbo. It's significantly less expensive at $30,660 starting. Now obviously that is not going to be the top-end trim, but even the top-end trim of the CX-5 is pretty reasonably priced because it will top out at about $38,000 before tax, title, license, and destination. That's a bit narrower of a price range than we find in most of the mainline competition. The interesting twist with the new turbocharged model is that we now actually have 4 trims of the turbocharged CX-5 and only 3 trims of the non-turbo model. But that price tag is important to keep in mind as we start talking about the competition. The first competitor I want to talk about is actually inside the Mazda lineup, and it's the Mazda CX-30. This is Mazda's smaller crossover. It's essentially an inflated version of the Mazda 3 sedan and Mazda 3 hatchback. And I think it's the more practical alternative, really, to the Mazda 3 hatch. What's most interesting about Mazda's line for 2021 is that they're jamming the 2.5-liter turbocharged engine under almost everything in the lineup. And honestly, that's a really great thing because this is an excellent engine, and it makes the CX-30 one of the fastest entries in the subcompact crossover segment. But the CX-30 isn't quite subcompact in the same way that a Hyundai Venue is, for instance. The CX-30 is notably larger than most of the competition. There's about an $800 difference between these two vehicles, but keep in mind the CX-30 is going to come with standard all-wheel drive when you get the turbocharged engine, and it's optional on the CX-5 Turbo. The CX-30 is the latest interpretation of Mazda's design language, so the exterior and the interior, although they are very familiar if you've moved out of a CX-5 into a CX-30, it is going to feel a little bit more modern, and I think a little bit more premium, honestly, as well. You can expect some big changes the next time we see a new CX-5, which is just about around the corner according to the rumor mill. With that out of the way, let's dive into the first non-Mazda competitor that obviously has to be the bestseller in this segment, the Toyota RAV4. Now the RAV4 is an interesting vehicle because it is the bestseller that is not a truck in the United States, and as a result, there are a ton of different ways you can configure your RAV4. There's a base naturally aspirated engine, there are 2 different mechanical all-wheel drive systems. One includes a torque vectoring and limited slip function in the rear. We also have a regular hybrid and of course the brand new plug-in hybrid as well. There are on-road focused versions, there are off-road focused versions, there's the really snazzy limited model, and if you want to get an even nicer interior, you could look at something like the Toyota Venza, which really is just the luxury RAV4. Depending on exactly how you want to slot the RAV4 in against the competition, definitely keep that Venza in mind, because if you look at the RAV4 and you think to yourself, I wish it had a more premium interior or a few more premium touches or a bigger infotainment system, keep in mind that there is the Venza. Obviously, the RAV4's big claim to fame is reliability. It's also availability because there are simply more models and options to choose from, more dealers to choose from, etc. We also have an enormous cargo area in the RAV4. Although I do find the passenger area in the RAV just a little bit tight, not quite enough room back there in the second row for rear-facing child seats and an adult up front. The rest of the interior in the RAV4 is very large, and frankly, it's a very, very easy to live with vehicle. The RAV4 really shines when you start taking a look at the hybrid models, which are expected to be about a 25% share of RAV4 sales. You get about 40 miles per gallon in that RAV4, definitely high 30s in regular everyday daily driving. Even if you start beating your RAV4 a little bit harder out in your favorite winding mountain road, it's going to be averaging over 30 mpg. Now, performance is obviously not going to be where the CX-5 Turbo is, but there's a reason that the RAV4 Hybrid has long been one of my favorites in this segment. And the last time I drove the CX-5 Turbo and the RAV4 Hybrid, I basically said it was essentially a tie. To be perfectly honest, I still think that's true, and if you want a little bit more performance, you could get the RAV4 Prime, which is definitely swift. However, it's really hard to find, and of course it's a plug-in hybrid, not a regular hybrid, so not everybody's going to be interested in that, but if you can find a RAV4 Prime for sticker price and you qualify for the full federal tax credit, it's definitely going to be within the pricing range of the CX-5 Turbo. It's just not going to feel quite as nice inside. I think the CX-5 really excels when it comes to interior refinement. I also love the exterior design. When it comes to handling, some folks might be surprised that certain versions of the RAV4 outhandle the CX-5. Now, that's partially because Toyota offers us things like a torque vectoring rear axle, but we also get wider tires in certain models of that RAV4, and it's a brand new platform design. The CX-5 is getting on in years. Now, the CX-5 I think has a bit more potential. As I've said before, one thing that's always struck me as funny is that when Mazda bumps up the power levels in their vehicles, they don't always increase the tire size. We see that in the CX-5, we see that in the CX-30, the Mazda 3, etc. The tires in the CX-5 are just a little bit narrow. They're definitely not the grippiest compound out there. But the important thing here is that the CX-5 has a lot of potential. And if you were to upgrade the tires and put stickier tires, wider tires in the CX-5 aftermarket, it would definitely have the chops to compete with a lot of near luxury vehicles. That applies as we move on to the next competitor, the Honda CR-V. This is the second bestseller in this particular segment. For $30,450, approximately the price tag of the base CX-5 Turbo, you could get an EX-L trim Honda CR-V. It would have the 1.5-liter turbo and a continuously variable automatic transmission. Now, the CR-V is not exactly a spring chicken either, but I think the Mazda CX-5 has aged better than the CR-V. I like the interior design of the CR-V, but the infotainment and electronic systems definitely feel a little old. I was really hoping that when Honda announced the new hybrid model that they would update some of those systems, but they did not. It may not be a high priority for everybody out there, but personally, I would avoid the CR-V just based on the infotainment system as it is. It seems a lot glitchier than the system that we find in the RAV4 or in the Mazda CX-5, and it is certainly an awful lot slower. The screen is also smaller. It's not quite as high resolution either. On the other hand, the CR-V has proven reliable, fuel efficient, and it has an enormous cargo area and a really reasonably sized interior. So if you're looking for something that could accommodate a rear-facing child seat with me sitting up front, the CR-V is definitely there. For our next competitor, I'm going to skip over the Chevy Equinox because the 2-liter turbo has been discontinued, and I'm skipping over the Forester for the same reason. Hopefully Subaru will put the optional turbocharged engine that we find in the Outback and the Legacy into the Forester at some point soon, but at this point, we don't have that option in the US. In terms of power output, the Ford Escape's 2-liter turbo doesn't quite match what we see in the Mazda CX-5, but it is paired with a transmission that I think is a little bit more appropriate to the power output and a little bit more appropriate to this segment, really. It has Ford's latest 8-speed automatic transmission under the hood. The extra 2 gears really pay dividends when it comes to 0 to 60 acceleration. Thanks to a dealer-provided model that I was able to have very, very shortly, but unfortunately I was not able to film, I got 0 to 60 in 5.8 seconds in that model. That wasn't all-wheel drive trim. Hopefully, we'll be able to get our hands on the 2-liter turbo version of the Escape here very soon. Now, the Escape has a ton of options, and things can be a little bit confusing in the lineup. If you want the 2-liter turbo, you have to get the SEL trim, and you have to get all-wheel drive. So there's no exact corollary to the base version of the turbo in the CX-5, and that will set you back a minimum of $32,650. But as we see in a lot of Ford vehicles, there's a ton of cash on the hood, so at the moment there's a $3,000 national cash discount that will actually make it a little bit less expensive than the CX-5, even though all-wheel drive is standard. Even though the CX-5 is getting on in years, I think the interior is of more consistent quality than we find in the Escape. The Escape has some definite highs and some definite lows in the cabin. I'm not the biggest fan of the way the infotainment system is done in the dashboard, but the optional large LCD instrument cluster really dresses things up. The big thing you'll notice driving these two vehicles back to back is that the Escape definitely has a peppy feel to it. And a lot of that has to do with an aggressive starting ratio in the transmission and just the way that the engine and transmission were designed together. The 6-speed automatic transmission that we find in the Mazda CX-5 doesn't have my favorite ratios really in it, and I think it is holding the engine back because it has a massive amount of torque and really healthy horsepower figures, but you'll notice that 0 to 60 times aren't quite as fast as you might think. I suspect that when we finally see the long-rumored and hopefully soon to come out Mazda 8-speed automatic transmission, that things will definitely change. And I would suspect that this could be the fastest entry in the segment if we got a more modern automatic transmission. In terms of handling, I prefer the way the Escape handles out on the road, but I prefer the way the Mazda CX-5 feels out on the road. This is another situation where the CX-5 has a lot of potential, but due to Mazda's particular choices when it comes to tire size and tire compound, I don't think the CX-5 quite lives up to its potential based on what you get out of the factory. Now again, that's something that you can change yourself. And that's honestly one of the things that I like about the CX-5, because it's difficult to change the feel of a vehicle aftermarket. As I've said before, steering feel, steering feedback, the way the dynamics of the chassis behave, that's not something that you as a consumer can have too much control over after you've purchased the vehicle. But grip and road holding is definitely something that you can improve yourself. Let me know what you think about this down there in the comment section, but personally, if I were to choose between a vehicle that had sort of dull, lifeless steering, but excellent grip out on the road versus a vehicle that had great steering and handling feel, but less grip, I would take the model with less grip, because that's something that I could fix. All you have to do is stick wider and grippier tires on it, and as long as the chassis is able to accommodate those wider and grippier tires, then you've really leveled the playing field with that other vehicle from the factory. Because from the factory, you're not going to be able to change too much about the way the steering rack feels. And now to the important question, is the CX-5 still at the top of my charts? Well, the RAV4 definitely has a lot going for it. I love the hybrid model. The RAV4 Prime is excellent as well, as long as you can get your hands on one. It is really difficult to find at the moment. And I think that the Ford Escape has a lot going on for it as well. It certainly has a lot of great deals if you like the styling of the interior. But the CX-5 is still one of my favorites in this segment, and with the new lower cost on the turbocharged model, it's an excellent option for someone that doesn't want to break the bank, but wants a little bit of extra power and an awful lot more fun. Let me know what you think about that down there at the comment section. Also be sure and check out the merch store at aoamerch.com. You can find shirts right like this brand new design right here. Be sure and find me over at facebook.com, and if you want to find the lighter side of Alex and Autos, you can check me out over at Instagram as well. I'll see all of you later.